Well, it turns out that the people of ancient Israel, kind of weird in a few respects, they did some strange things. And one example that I would give you comes from a story in Acts 14 that features Paul and Barnabas in the city of Lystra, where they're ministering to the people of Lystra. And while there, Paul and Barnabas have healed a lame man. And the people of Lystra are so impressed by what Paul and Barnabas have done that on the spot, they declare these two guys to be gods. And now naturally, that's going to be a problem, right? That's a thing that needs some correction. And so my question is, what do Paul and Barnabas do to calm things down to get these folks' attention? Could they just maybe raise their hands, right? That's simple enough. Maybe we find the nearest platform or stool to stand on. Or there's the age-old shouting through cupped hands. They could have done any of these things, but Paul and Barnabas don't do that. What do? Well, here's what we find in Acts 14. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of this, they tore their clothes. They tore their clothes? I don't know about you, but I picture something kind of along these lines. I picture a Hulk Hogan sort of moment, and I have to say, that's just weird. That's a strange response in that situation. That's hard for me to relate to. I mean, can you imagine if every time that we were upset or wanted to get somebody's attention, we started tearing stuff in half or off, whatever else it might be? I mean, just think of like what the Senate or the House of Representatives would look like after a heated debate. That would be a messy situation. And it's not just the things that they did, the people of ancient Israel also said some really strange things. Take, for example, the Song of Solomon. If you don't know much about this book, it's basically a lengthy back and forth between a man and a woman professing their love to one another. Well, in chapter 4, it's the man's turn to charm the woman, and so he hits her with this gem of a pickup line. Describing the woman, he says, "Your hair is like a flock of goats descending from the hills of Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of sheep just shorn, coming up from the washing. Each has its twin, not one of them is alone." What do you think, ladies? You swooning right now? Well, no, of course you're not. Just like with Paul and Barnabas, this passage from the Song of Solomon is just difficult for me to connect with. And today I want to talk to you about another part of the Bible that for my entire Christian walk, I have found just a little bit difficult to understand. And that's idols and idolatry. And I want to introduce you to the idea by zeroing in on a passage that comes to us from Isaiah 44. So here's what that passage says. "The blacksmith takes a tool and works with it in the coals. He shapes an idol with hammers. He forges it with the might of his arm. The carpenter measures with a line and makes an outline with a marker. He roughs it out with chisels and marks it with compasses. He shapes it in human form in all its glory, that it may dwell in a shrine. He cut down cedars, or perhaps took a cypress or oak. He let it grow among the trees of the forest, or planted a pine, and the rain made it grow. It is used as fuel for burning. Some of it he takes and warms himself. He kindles a fire and bakes bread, but he also fashions a god and worships it. He makes an idol and bows down to it. He prays to it and says, 'Save me, you are my God.'" So to recap, there are two craftsmen in this passage. One's a blacksmith, the other's a carpenter, who have decided to take it upon themselves to create a statue and call it a god. And apparently this was a pretty common practice back in Old Testament times. For example, in the time of Moses, the Israelites built a golden calf while Moses was atop Mount Sinai talking with God. And a bit later, King Solomon, despite his wisdom, eventually turned his back on God and began worshiping 4 different idols representing 4 foreign gods. And in the book of Daniel, King Nebuchadnezzar made a golden statue and commanded every person in his kingdom to bow down and worship it. So this stuff is all over the Bible. And again, I have to say, for me, it makes absolutely no sense. Never in my entire life have I felt compelled to whittle a figure or mold a statue, declare it my God, and start worshiping. Are you with me on that? My guess is a lot of you are. This stuff, though, is all over the Bible, and it sounds absolutely crazy. And apparently, the logic is lost on God as well, because picking up where we left off in Isaiah 44, here's what God has to say in response to those two folks who are making idols for themselves. They know nothing. They understand nothing. Their eyes are plastered over so they cannot see, and their minds closed so they cannot understand. No one stops to think. No one has the knowledge or understanding to say, half of it I used for fuel. I even baked bread over its coals. I roasted meat and I ate. Shall I make a detestable thing from what is left? Shall I bow down to a block of wood? Now, I hear that and I think, amen. Like, totally good on that, God. I was not going to make an idol anyway. That's a pretty primitive, sort of backwards thing to do. So we're good, case closed. And my guess is that pretty much all of you in this room, online, are in the same boat with me. I'm guessing that you've never made and worshiped a statue before. And yet, I'm going to go out on a limb this morning and say that I'm going to guess you still have a problem with idolatry. I know that I do. And to understand what I mean, we're going to need to go a little bit deeper. We're going to have to go beyond the physical, material construction of idols and into the hearts of the men and women who chose to make those idols. We may not be able to understand the impulse they had to craft figures and statues, but I assure you that we can relate to the heart condition that led to those impulses. To help you get your head around what I mean by that, let's shift the conversation ever so slightly. Let's take a step away from a term that we don't use a whole lot in 2023, idolatry, and take a step toward a term we're much more familiar with, idolize. So look up the word idolize, and you'll find a definition along these lines: to admire or revere, to love greatly or excessively. Now, all throughout the Bible, we are encouraged to idolize God. We're encouraged to show him admiration, reverence, great love. And there's a good reason for that. God is undoubtedly deserving of that sort of love, for one, because he's done some pretty amazing things. Things like setting the stars in the sky. Things like forming the entire earth and everything in it. Things like breathing life into us and offering us the hand of friendship to form a relationship with him. And those are just the examples that we find in the book of Genesis. God has done great things for us and our ancestors all throughout human history. And it's for that reason, among others, that we should idolize God. And yet, in the days of ancient Israel, many didn't idolize God. Why? What was it about the men and women of the ancient world that led them to idolize a block of wood or some cut stone over the God that I've just described to you? Here's my theory. God offers us a lot, but the block of wood offers us something too. In fact, it offers us something that God doesn't offer us: complete control. The Bible teaches us that we are at our best because we align ourselves to God. We are shaped in his image, and we achieve the best form of life when we align our hearts and our actions with the image of God. In other words, we become our best when we fall in line behind God and do our best to follow in his footsteps. But the reality is that many of us today would rather have things the other way around. We want to take the lead and to have God follow us. We would prefer to shape God into our image. And frankly, it's not difficult to see why. There's something really attractive about the notion of having a God who is small or malleable. If God is powerful and an active participant in this world, then we have to answer to him. We have to take into account what he wants or what he expects. But if God is just something that exists in our heads, right? If God is a being who is passive or who is flexible, then suddenly I don't have to answer to anybody. I'm in charge. It can lead to some interesting philosophies such as these. From modern philosopher Vishen Lakhiani, you can hack religion. You can take the best of all the beauty that human spirituality has provided around the world and create your own religion. Your spirituality should be discovered, not inherited. Or, from famed architect Frank Lloyd Wright, I believe in God, only I spell it nature. Gandhi bought into this idea too when he said, religion is entirely a personal matter. Each one could approach his creator as he liked. And it's not just philosophers and celebrities who ascribe to this way of thinking. In 2020, some researchers at Arizona Christian University conducted a study that asked participants to weigh in on this question: where does moral truth come from? Where does moral truth come from? 58% of respondents to that survey said there was no such thing as absolute or universal truth, and that moral truth was up to each individual to decide for him or herself. 58%. And before you go saying that that's just one particular group that's to blame for that, know that this transcended all kinds of people groups. This was true of more than half of Democrats, more than half of Republicans, more than half of people under 50, and more than half of people over 50. Even among church attenders, 46% said that moral truth was dictated by the individual. So what does this study tell us? It tells us we're control freaks. It tells us that we want control. We want a God who lets us steer the ship, who gives us the freedom to live how we want to live, absolutely guilt-free. We don't want an omnipotent God who put the universe together and built us for a purpose. We want a God that we can put in our pockets and carry with us wherever we choose to go. And you know what that sounds like? It sounds kind of like an idol. When my son Henry was a baby, he would sometimes take a while to fall asleep, and often as he was struggling to stay awake, the kid would get grumpy. Now, we tried a lot of things to soothe him. We had a rocking chair, we had a swing, we would go for drives in the car, and sometimes these things worked, and sometimes they didn't work. But shortly before Henry's birthday, we found the kid's kryptonite, a little-known Christian artist named J.J. Heller. Now, most of you probably haven't heard her music before, but it's impossible to describe her voice. It's lovely, but it's hard to describe without also using words like dreamy or sleepy. So whenever Henry was trying to fall asleep or trying not to fall asleep, we would put JJ on, and within 5 minutes, I kid you not, the kid would be out every single time. The only problem, of course, was that I would be not far behind him. And when you're driving 70 miles per hour on the interstate, that's not the best situation. Anyway, I've spent a lot of time over the last several years listening to J.J. Heller's catalog of music. Her songs bounce around in my head often. And when I was preparing for today's message, the lyrics of one of those songs came to mind for me. It's a song called Small, and I'm not going to sing it to you. You don't want that. I don't want that. Nobody wants that. But I will read it to you as a poem. So in the song, JJ is singing directly to God, and here's what she says. Cardboard cutouts on the floor. People wish that you were more like what they wanted you to be. Eventually, they won't have much of you at all. In their theology, the walls are closing in on you, but you cannot be contained at all. I don't want to make you small. I don't want to fit you in my pocket or on a cross around my throat, because you are brighter than the sun. You're closer than the tiny thoughts I have of you, but I could never fathom you at all. What I think J.J. Heller seems to understand is something that's lost on a lot of people today. And that's that as nice as it might be to have a teeny tiny God that lets us define our own morality and even reality, there's a real danger here as well. You see, having a pocket-sized God is really great when things go according to plan. But what about when we get in over our heads? Will our personal truth or DIY spirituality come to our rescue then? Will our manufactured philosophies and ideologies comfort us for when, example, we lose a child? Will they help us find common ground with a spouse when our marriage is drifting? Will they fill the void that depression leaves in our lives? Or what about the ultimate desperate situation? Death. Will anything that we create, be it medicine or meal plans or fitness routines, can any of that save us from death? Well, the answer obviously is no. You see, for that sort of thing, we need someone with power, someone who is brighter than the sun and who cannot be contained. And maybe you're sitting there right now and you're thinking to yourself, phew, like thank goodness I'm in the minority of people. Thank goodness I am a person who puts my faith and my trust in God. And if that's you, I'm happy for you, genuinely happy for you. But as I said earlier, I don't think you're going to be completely out of the woods on this whole idolatry business just yet. And to explain that to you, give me a brief moment to tell you a bit about ancient history. In the ancient world, most nations were ruled by kings. You know this. And most kings considered themselves to either be divinely appointed by a god, or more commonly, they considered themselves to be gods. This was really common. And the way that they would reinforce this idea in their kingdoms is that they would commission statues and or shrines of themselves or their gods to be erected all throughout their kingdom. This practice was ubiquitous. It was true of the Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks, the Medes, the Persians. Basically, name an ancient civilization, and this was their modus operandi. The exception was ancient Israel. In fact, ancient Israelites were forbidden from creating statues depicting their God. Any idea why? Genesis 1:27. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Do you see it? Do you understand what Genesis 1:27 is saying? The people of God have no need to create images of God. Why? Because God has already created images of himself. That's you, and it's me. The single, solitary reason why we were created was to represent God and his character here on earth, not merely through how we look, but rather through things like how we carry ourselves, how we treat others, how we manage the blessings that God has given us. We are infinitely more interesting and complex than a block of wood or a slab of stone could ever be. But here's the rub. Like a sculpture or a carving, we too are prone to deterioration. We might be created in the image of God, but life has a way of beating us up and marring that image. And frankly, if we're honest with ourselves, we have a tendency to beat and disfigure ourselves too. The only way then that we can consistently reflect God is to routinely remind ourselves of what he looks like and to invite him to continue shaping and reshaping us all throughout our lives. In other words, we have to give him control. We have to swim upstream from a self-obsessed culture and give ourselves over to the will of God. And let me just ask you plainly, are you doing that? Are you giving him control? Are you surrendering your life to God? Or are you falling into the trap of self-serving idolatry? A few questions that might help you with that assessment. First, look at your schedule. Look at your priorities. If I were to take a look at your calendar, would I get the impression that your life is centered on yourself or on God? A second thing, look at your relationship with God's word. You know, for the past couple of weeks, Pastor Mike has been working through a study of the book of Habakkuk, where we've met an ordinary man who's struggling with the reality that God isn't always who we want or expect him to be. And I wonder, are you okay with that reality? Are you comfortable with a God who doesn't fit neatly into your pocket or who might challenge you to live or think differently? When you read the Bible, are you looking for passages that will reinforce what you want to be true? That will support your politics or your life choices? Or are you approaching God's word with humility and inviting him to shape you as he sees fit? Third, and finally, look at your approach to church. You know, I read a super convicting book recently by a guy named Carl R. Truman that explores the relationship between faith and what he calls expressive individualism. A quote from his book hit me like a ton of bricks, and I want to share it with you today. He writes, "In the era of the self, institutions such as schools and churches are places where one goes to perform, not to be formed." Let me read that one more time. In the era of the self, institutions such as schools and churches are places where one goes to perform, not to be formed. And with that in mind, I invite you to think about the things that maybe you're involved with here at the Ridge. Things like Sunday services, or youth group, or a small group, or maybe a serving team. And consider then, what is your heart posture toward that thing? Are you there to fill your social bucket, to check a box, to masquerade as a good person? Or are you there humbly asking God to shape you through that group, that activity, whatever it might be? It's a profoundly different experience when you go in with an open hand and let God do his work. I want to leave you with one final thought this morning. Prior to embarking on a years-long ministry that would change the course of the world forever, Jesus was in many respects just an average guy who needed a way to make a living. And there were all kinds of things, all kinds of professions that God could have placed Jesus into. Given what he would go on to do, a job as a shepherd or as a fisherman would have made a lot of sense. In light of the parables that he would tell, something like a farmer would have worked as well. Or maybe the most obvious thing of all would have been to make him a rabbi in training. But God didn't place Jesus into any of those professions. He had a different line of work in mind. God made Jesus a carpenter. And in light of today's message, I have to say I absolutely love that. Genesis 1:27 tells us that we were created in the image of God. The book of Dayne, aka my own life experience, tells me that we don't tend to take very good care of that image. Thankfully, I know a pretty good carpenter. Will you pray with me?